I want to start by paying tribute to Shane O Farrell and her family for pursuing this following the tragic loss of their son Shane. I want to welcome the motion from Fianna Fáil and the amendment from Sinn Féin, and we'll be voting for and supporting both. We know from history that when a state, its ministers and top personnel close ranks and bar people from accessing justice, that the hurt and trauma of the original injustice is multiplied and made even harder to deal with. The loss of their son and brother is an impossible loss, and the search for truth about the events that led to that loss is an added and equally impossible burden on anyone. But to find at every turn that your quest for justice is barred, obstructed and complicated is an outrageous insult, not just to the O'Farrell family, but to all citizens in this country. It has to stop, and it has to stop tonight. This is the second time we've had a substantial debate in the Dáil on this case, and not for the first time the Dáil has spoken on this, and not for the first time the Government and the Ministers have ignored the voice of the Dáil. Let me be clear, Minister, that you've ignored the previous Dáil motion calling for an independent inquiry into all aspects of Shane's death, and now you are fundamentally undermining the scoping exercise process. The Minister has said numerous times that the family could meet with Judge Houghton and suggest the terms of reference. In fact, in March of this year, you told me in a PQ, and I quote, "Of course it is open to Judge Houghton to propose changes to the terms of reference." But in reality, Minister, it is the Minister himself and the Attorney-General that are setting the terms of reference and making it impossible for the truth of all the events before and after Shane's death to be revealed. Now, the Taoiseach told the Dáil that Judge Houghton will be able to produce his initial report into the death of Shane O Farrell in the next few days. And I think we need to clarify, and it should be said by yourselves, that this interim report concerns timelines only, because the comment from the Taoiseach would suggest that this motion this evening is of no consequence and that the new terms are producing this interim report. I think it needs to be clear that when the Minister, who has now left the chamber, says, "I can assure the House there is no intention on the part of myself or the Government to limit the scoping exercise in any way," I'm expecting to receive the interim report by Friday the 15th, although I understand that Judge Houghton is willing to delay this to accommodate further engagement with the O'Farrell family. But I have been guided by legal advice from the Attorney-General, and the terms of reference of this scope and exercise must be compliant in lines with the jurisprudence established by the Supreme Court in the decision of Shatter versus Gearing case. That same case was quoted to me in the High Court last Wednesday. It seems to be wheeled out quite frequently. I think we have to be clear that the purpose of this scoping inquiry should be to review the failings in the mechanisms of the state in the investigation of Shane O Farrell's death and the prosecution and sentencing of his killer. That is the key, and that is the centre of the family's quest for justice and their attempt to make sense of their son's death and the loss that ensued from that. That's the only purpose that seems to me for any inquiry into Shane O Farrell's death, to review the failings in the mechanism of this state in the investigation of this young man's death and the prosecution and sentencing of his killer. Under the finalised terms of reference, this cannot happen, as the hands of the judge are tied. He is effectively barred from looking at the very core of this case and the reasons that this family have worked so hard to seek an inquiry into it in the first place. It's an absolute insult to Lucia, to her daughters and to the entire family, and indeed to the memory of Shane. And so, if you look back on it, we've gone in quick succession from a terms of reference that were firstly to review the reports of GSOC, then widened to include criminal prosecution in relation to Shane's death and the previous prosecutions and findings of the inquest, and now we find it's been shrunk again to the current terms of reference, which will only take into account the reports of GSOC, with no mention of the criminal prosecution in relation to this young man's death, or the previous prosecution, or the inquest, or indeed anything that Judge Houghton originally had in the terms of reference. No mention, in effect, for the very reason that Shane's family have pursued justice and campaigned for years for an inquiry that would shed light into the events of this devastating loss. The Minister has repeatedly stated that there is no attempt to cover up or to hide the truth. And if he wants us to believe that, or if words have any meaning, then he should ensure that the terms of reference of this inquiry cover all aspects in relation to Shane's death, the previous prosecutions and the findings of the inquest. If he fails to do so, we can only conclude that for the Irish state, the truth and nothing but the truth would be, in the words of the deceased Lord Denning of the Birmingham 6 trial, it would open up an appalling vista for this state. I think it's time that we came clean and, instead of dragging this out for years and years for this family, open up a proper inquiry into all of these events and let justice be seen to be done.
I got independence for